At 2:17 in the morning, in a room on the third floor of the University of Groningen's Sleep Research Center, a man named Pieter Hoekstra is dying. Not literally, but if you ran the relevant diagnostics, his EEG trace crossing from alpha into theta, his thalamic relay neurons suppressing, his sensory cortex going dark strip by strip, you might have trouble articulating what the clinical distinction is. His eyes are sealed. Not by his choice, not at first. The levator palpebrae muscles simply received their instructions and stopped. His auditory cortex stopped filtering the corridor sounds about 6 minutes ago. His skin has ceased reporting temperature. The technician on duty, Dr. Annika Voss, has been logging these transitions for 11 years and still finds the graphs odd. She watches the waveforms cross from alpha into theta, those long, slow undulations that mark the end of one thing, and writes onset 0217 in her log, and pours herself a second coffee from the machine in the corner. She has watched this happen more than 4,000 times. It does not fully normalize. Here is what most people believe about sleep, that it is a pause, a waiting room between two chapters of the same continuous life. You go in, you come out, and nothing fundamental has changed. Time has passed. The body has done its maintenance. You've had some dreams you'll mostly forget. The you who went to sleep is the you who woke up. This feels beyond question. It feels like the floor under your feet, so basic it barely qualifies as a belief. It is also something you cannot actually verify. The reason is not philosophical maneuvering. It lives inside the literal mechanics of what sleep does to your brain. Once you understand the mechanism, the certainty starts to look less like knowledge and more like a story. A very persuasive story, composed by the same organ that fabricates everything else you've ever experienced. Dr. Voss's electrode grid touches 23 points on Pieter's scalp. What it shows right now is not stillness. This is the first error in the common picture. Sleep is not the brain going dark. Sleep is the brain cutting itself off from you. There is a structure called the thalamus, roughly walnut-sized, seated near the geometric center of the brain, responsible for routing nearly all incoming sensory information up to the cortex. Sight, sound, touch, pain. None of it reaches conscious awareness without first passing through the thalamic relay. At sleep onset, the thalamus does something that should feel significant, but has been rendered ordinary through sheer repetition. It closes. Not figuratively. It floods its own relay neurons with inhibitory signals, actively suppressing their output, shutting down the incoming data stream. The external world continues without interruption. Traffic moves on the street below. The fluorescent lights hum. Pieter's skin is still warm and still receiving sensation. The thalamus has simply decided, unilaterally, that none of this is information worth forwarding to the cortex anymore. From outside a glass door, a person falls asleep. From inside the architecture, the world ends. And then the brain, severed from external input, does what it has always done when the sensory feed drops. It generates its own. The default mode network, a distributed system of midline cortical structures that activates specifically when the brain is not processing the outside world, spins up. It begins producing narrative, characters, locations, conversation, the particular emotional weight of a scene that should not exist. An entire procedurally generated environment with consistent internal logic and no author. We call this dreaming and treat it as a sideshow, a curiosity to describe over breakfast. It may be the brain's primary native state, and waking life the interruption. This is what keeps Dr. Voss company at 2 in the morning. During all of this, the closed gates, the self-generated theater, the circuitry that maintains your continuous sense of self is not patiently holding your identity in escrow. The tightly integrated loop between the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the default mode network, the system that generates the feeling of being a particular, continuous someone, has gone offline. Not into a low-power holding state. Offline in the same sense that a server goes offline when the physical connection is cut. The process stops. The state is not held anywhere. There is no backup running. When you wake up, you do not resume where you left off. You reboot. The person who woke up this morning did not experience last night, not as a continuous thread of existence. The version of you who closed their eyes at 11:43 lost consciousness. What reconstituted itself at 6:51 was assembled from stored records, declarative memory, procedural habit, the deep architectural template of a particular personality. It was not resumed from a paused state, it was generated from documentation. And its first cognitive act, before the alarm had fully registered its meaning, was to feel certain, completely, groundlessly certain, that it had persisted through the hours in between. That certainty is a confabulation, the most reliable confabulation in biology. It has never, across a healthy brain, produced a detectable error, which is precisely why no one ever questions it. The reconstruction is so good that it generates its own alibi. Neurologists call the transitional zone between sleep and full waking hypnopompia. Most people experience it as the groggy few seconds before the clock's meaning arrives. But EEG records from this lab and others describe something more exact. During that window, which runs anywhere from 2 to 10 seconds, the prefrontal cortex is coming back online, the hippocampus is loading, and the network responsible for self-referential thought, the sense of there being a particular someone behind the eyes, has not yet fully reintegrated. What exists in those seconds is a biological system running without an operator. The hardware is active, the self has not arrived. Then memory loads. The operator materializes, and they arrive certain, retroactively, entirely, that they were never absent. Pieter Hoekstra will wake at 6:44, a few minutes before his alarm, and he will experience himself as perfectly continuous. He went to sleep last night. He woke up this morning. He is the same man who sat in this chair and let Dr. Voss tape electrodes to his scalp 6 hours earlier. This will feel less like a belief and more like a precondition for having any beliefs at all. Dr. Voss watches him through the observation window. She has her own version of this certainty every morning. She knows exactly how it is manufactured. She finds it no less convincing for knowing. Philosophers carry a thought experiment called the teleporter problem. A machine destroys you at point A and reconstructs you atom for atom at point B, every memory intact, every preference and fear reproduced without loss. Is what arrives at point B you, or a copy who cannot tell the difference from the inside? The problem has occupied academic literature for decades, producing discomfort through the intuition that something real would be lost in the gap, even if nothing measurable disappeared. Sleep is this problem, staged every night, in every sleeping body on the planet, at no perceptible cost, with no one ever filing a report. The gap is real. The thread breaks. What crosses the night is not continuous experience. It is record, a detailed archive of who you were yesterday, reassembled each morning into a confident first-person present with enough precision that the seam is invisible from inside or out. You are not persisting through the dark hours. You are being reconstructed from your own notes. And now the part that tilts the argument in a different direction. The reconstruction works. Not approximately, not with a margin of error that affection smooths over. It works with a fidelity that no human-built system has matched. What wakes each morning carries the exact shape of last year's grief, the precise pleasure of a specific recent conversation, the unfinished thought from 1142. It carries the particular way you reach for your glass, the particular tolerance you have for a certain kind of noise, the sound of a laugh belonging to someone you haven't seen in years but would still recognize across a room. By every measure available to the people who love you, what wakes up is you. This suggests two possibilities. Either the self is more durable than the continuity argument implies. Identity was never really about unbroken experience, and the nightly gap is simply irrelevant to what the self actually is. Or, the self is exactly as fragile as the argument suggests, and we are spectacularly fortunate that the reconstruction has never, in all of human history, made a detectable error. Dr. Voss believes the second. She wrote a paper in 2019, the title of which was softened at editorial request. It received 12 citations. She still considers it her most honest work. The EEG shows Pieter in deep, slow-wave sleep now, the long canyon valleys of delta waves, the phase during which synaptic connections are pruned or consolidated, during which growth hormone releases in its largest daily pulse, during which whatever is being processed behind the electrode grid remains completely invisible to the equipment. He breathes 10 times per minute. His face has shed the small habitual tensions that usually compose his expression. He looks, under this fluorescent light, like a question about what the face is for when there is no one using it. He will leave this lab in the morning with no memory of the night and a complete certainty of having endured it. Dr. Voss logs his delta wave entry time, stretches her neck, and thinks about a sentence she has been trying to get right for 2 years. That the persistence of personal identity across sleep is not a property of consciousness, but a property of memory. And that what we experience as the continuous self may be less a flame that burns without interruption than a very convincing morning reconstruction, assembled fresh each day from the notes left by the person who was here before. So accurate that the new arrival believes it is the author of those notes, rather than their latest product. She has never published the sentence. It tends to produce a discomfort that is difficult to do anything useful with. Outside the building, Groningen persists in the dark without assistance. Every street lamp, every bridge, every stone wall remains continuously, stubbornly itself through the dark hours. None of it needs to reconstruct from memory at dawn. None of it has to be convinced it was there. That is the difference. The last thing consciousness does each night, before the thalamic gates close and the external world stops being information, is accept the arrangement. The first thing it does each morning is forget there was ever anything to accept.